This year, 2007, the Chautauqua Institution celebrates its 134th season as a center, a community, a resource, a place of intellectual stimulation, where faith is restored and the arts valued. Each summer, Chautauqua presents 9 weeks of artistic, educational, and religious programming. Our 4 pillars of art, education, religion, and recreation make Chautauqua a singular experience beyond description. This audio experience is part of a program that records the famous Chautauqua Morning Lecture, the afternoon lectures at the Hall of Philosophy, sponsored by the Department of Religion, the exceptional Sunday morning worship services at the amphitheater, and other special events. We take you now to Chautauqua, where today's program is about to begin.
This morning's lecture and all of this week's education and religion programming is funded by Helen Boyle through a gift to Chautauqua Institution. This is the 7th consecutive summer that Helen has provided the support for Chautauqua's programming known as the Abrahamic Community, a program that seeks to create an understanding of how Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can define a common purpose and seek a common mind. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend our thanks to Helen and the entire Boyle family for their generosity to Chautauqua and for their commitment to this program. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Magonet. Dr. Magonet is one of Europe's leading Jewish thinkers, scholars, and teachers who participated in the Chautauqua Interfaith Conference held at the Ishmaeli Center in London, England in November 2005. Dr. Magonet recently retired after 20 years as principal of Leo Beck College in London, which provides future leadership for the progressive Jewish community in the UK, Europe, Australia, South Africa, and worldwide by training rabbis and teachers. He also led the college's Department of Biblical Studies and is now Emeritus Professor of Bible. For more than 30 years, Dr. Magonet has organized an annual Jewish Christian Bible Week and an annual Jewish Christian Muslim Student Conference in Germany, and described his experience in interfaith dialogue in Talking to the Other, published in 2003. He has also published several books on a popular approach to the Hebrew Bible, including A Rabbi Reads the Bible and A Rabbi Reads the Psalms. He has traveled from London to be with us this week for his first visit to Chautauqua. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for Jonathan Magonet.
This is kind of scary, but I will cope. I have to explain, I will be speaking in British English for most of this talk, and I hope you will be able to follow me in the other English that you use. That's just establishing my credentials. Actually, I feel greatly honored to have been invited to speak here at Chautauqua in this magnificent setting. And my topic is the Hebrew Bible and its Jewish interpretation. But I find myself somewhat torn, certainly in deciding how to limit what for me has been really a lifetime study. But also, my problem is to present to you something that, at least in theory, must be very familiar, since the Hebrew Bible, in its guise as the Old Testament, is an integral part of Western civilization and culture. And even if it's less well known today than in the past, it is certainly part of what makes our culture real. Yet precisely because of our familiarity with it, and particularly with the cadences of the King James translation, the world that I want to show you is distinctly alien. It is alien to a large extent because Jewish exegesis for most of the past 2,000 years has been conducted in Hebrew, which is the original language of the Bible itself. So there is a kind of intimacy in the relationship between Jewish interpretation and the Bible itself that is hard to convey to those who are outside of it. So this exercise will therefore require a certain amount of unlearning of things that we might have taken for granted, whether because of images and memories from childhood religious education, or echoes of a lifetime's engagement with the church, or exposure to the assured interpretations of contemporary preachers working in English. To give a few examples, in the Hebrew Bible, God does not command Abraham to take his son and sacrifice him, but he says instead, kach na, please take. The grammatical form kach, take, is indeed an imperative, but it has been modified and softened by the addition of the word na, which means please. So it becomes a request or an invitation. And this is what it has to be, otherwise God is merely a bully with nothing at stake in Abraham's acceptance or refusal. Moreover, since the episode in Genesis 22 is introduced as a test, God tested Abraham. Without a real element of choice on Abraham's part, the test becomes meaningless. Now, whether his willingness to sacrifice his son is evidence of his passing the test or failing it is open for debate. In fact, it is shocking that Abraham, who was fighting for Sodom and Gomorrah, was willing to sacrifice his son. This is evidence of a very strange and difficult problem within Abraham. As Elie Wiesel is reported to have said, if it was a test, who gave up first? It's God who intervened and stopped him, and in my reading, God was quite horrified that Abraham was prepared to do it. It takes God to stop some people from killing in the name of God. The Hebrew Bible neither advocates nor relishes revenge. Indeed, the biblical creation of cities of refuge to which an accidental manslaughterer could flee to avoid the family's revenge is an example of the attempt to prevent revenge killings and ensure the due process of law. Nevertheless, the phrase, an eye for an eye, does occur on 3 occasions, and it is often cited as evidence of the vindictiveness and vengefulness of the Hebrew Bible, and then quoted in anti-Jewish comments or in attacks on the policies of the State of Israel. However, a serious reading of the texts where the phrase occurs indicates that we are dealing here with a technical, legal formula, common throughout the ancient Near East. So rather it refers to some form of monetary compensation for damage that has been done, the financial equivalent of the damage caused by the loss of an eye or other organ. And that is how rabbinic exegesis has understood it for over 2,000 years. So when you hear or you read another example of an eye for an eye, rethink, please. Who is the neighbor that we are supposed to love as ourselves, according to that famous phrase that first appears at a climactic point in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. My father taught me to remember the exact verse, as it is chapter 19, verse 18, and 1918 marked the end of the First World War. From the immediate biblical context, it is clearly not a universal statement about the entire world of potential neighbors. Rather, it is limited to fellow Israelites who share a covenantal relationship with God. But that self-same chapter repeats the identical phrase a few verses later, but this time with regards the stranger, the resident alien who lives within Israelite society. You shall love him as yourself, says the text. It seems that the Hebrew Bible recognizes that we regard people in terms of us and them, of our own group and the others, yet demands that the identical commitment of loving care be given to both. In this regard, it is honest about human realities and so approaches the universal through the particular. That this teaching was to be a guiding principle of the biblical society for 1,000 years before Jesus quoted it tends to be overlooked. To return to another example, the Ten Commandments probably do not forbid stealing, despite the phrase usually translated as, "You shall not steal," lo tignov. The command appears within a sequence of laws beginning with murder and adultery, which in the biblical world require the death penalty. So mere theft is unlikely to be intended here. Instead, the use of the verb here must refer to a crime of similar magnitude that warrants the same punishment. And the clue is furnished by Joseph's complaint that he had been stolen, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. And the verb is the same one, ganav, and is explicitly used in this sense in Exodus 21:16, among the first laws of the covenant. Whoever steals a man and sells him warrants the death penalty. So the intention in the Ten Commandments is also to forbid something that destroys or irreparably damages the life of a fellow human being, not merely to steal an object. The real translation is not "you shall not steal," but effectively "you shall not kidnap and sell into slavery." Another example. It is highly unlikely that on the fateful day when Moses went out to see his brothers and killed an Egyptian taskmaster, that he knew that he also was an Israelite. After all, he had grown up in the court of Pharaoh. And all the movies, from the Ten Commandments to the Prince of Egypt, all have to introduce explanations about how he knew he was Jewish. His sister told him, somebody told him, they whispered in the court. The biblical verse, Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, actually uses the word brothers twice, once at the beginning and once at the end of the sentence. So it talks about his going out to his brothers to observe sivlotam, their burdens. However, in the context, this grammatical form, sivlotam, their burdens, can only refer to the burdens of the Egyptians. Compare its appearance in the previous chapter, verse 11 as well. So the redundant duplication of the word brothers is another hint that something else is going on under the surface of the text, especially given the precise and concise narrative style of the Hebrew Bible. As an Egyptian prince, Gesundheit. Sorry, as I was saying before I was... As an Egyptian prince, he goes out to see his Egyptian brothers. But when he sees the violence imposed on the Israelites, he identifies with the victims of oppression and takes a stand on their behalf. And these become his new brothers mentioned at the end of the same verse. Having sacrificed so much for them, no wonder he gets upset when they tell him off for interfering in the next verse, "Who made you a prince over us?" Nevertheless, this willingness to take a stand for justice, which is the first thing we learn about his character, seems to be the reason God chose him to lead the Israelites out of slavery. Incidentally, many translations suggest that Moses looked around and saw that no one was watching, so that in a somewhat cowardly way he struck the Egyptian. But again, this is to fail to understand the implications of the Hebrew text. The actual Hebrew phrase is Vayar ki ein ish. He saw that there was no man. The Hebrew term ish does not simply mean a man in the sense of anyone. It always refers to a person of substance or significance. So in this case, Moses saw that there was no man prepared to intervene, so finds himself forced to act. And this reading is actually borne out by the appearance of the identical phrase in Isaiah 59, verses 15 to 17. When God saw that there was injustice and saw that there was no man, vayar ki ein ish, God was forced to intervene personally. And this is incidentally an excellent example of how the later biblical books often comment on or interpret the earlier ones. Nor is God merely the arbitrary, vengeful and perpetually angry figure so often portrayed in polemics against the Old Testament. In a rabbinic story, God intended to rule the world with strict justice. But Abraham argued with God that if that was the case, no human being could survive under such a regime. So God agreed to moderate justice with mercy. And we exist in the tension between these two poles. Now, this rabbinic idea is borne out within biblical passages. In an extraordinary self-revelation to Moses, God is revealed as El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet, Nosei Avon v'Fesha v'Chata'a, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and full of faithful love, forgiving iniquity, wrongdoing and sin. Exodus 34:7. However, this same context does continue by stating that God will show mercy to 1,000 generations, but visit punishment onto the 3rd and 4th generation. Again, this is seen as evidence of a vengeful, cruel deity pursuing punishment throughout the history of later generations. However, I think the correct interpretation of this passage is the one suggested by Martin Buber. The issue here is about the responsibility of the adult Israelite male, who is the partner with God in the covenant. This patriarchal figure is defined in the Bible in terms not only of his individual self, but also of the wife, children and grandchildren, land, animals and servants that belong to him. So what the passage here indicates as a warning is that the wrongdoer does not stand alone in his actions, but bears responsibility for his entire family. What happens to him has immediate consequences for his children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren who are alive at this moment in time. The contrast is between 1,000 generations and this particular generation, not about some punishment continuing on down through subsequent periods. But the rabbinic view that we exist in the tension between mercy and justice is illustrated by the other pole within which the God of the Hebrew Bible wishes to see the world guided. When choosing Abraham as the potential ancestor of a new humanity, it is for the explicit purpose of bringing the divine values of righteousness and justice into the world. Genesis 18 verse 19. To achieve this, God actually invites Abraham to challenge God in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. Will God destroy the innocent with the guilty? Abraham asks. Will not the judge of all the earth do justly? It appears that the God of this biblical narrative deliberately sets up a situation in which Abraham is encouraged to test out God's justice by challenging the divine will itself. And God uses a similar tactic with Moses when the Israelites misbehave by saying, "Leave me alone and I will punish them," so that Moses is given the space and indeed the divine encouragement to intervene and argue against God's stated intention. So these stories depict God as a pedagogue, inviting disagreement, but one with a kind of ironic sense of humor behind the story. So just to conclude this look at the otherness of many seemingly familiar biblical passages, what about the story of David and Goliath? The kindergarten version has little David successfully aiming his slingshot so that the stone hits Goliath in the forehead and he falls to the ground. Two things militate against this. Firstly, the reality of Goliath's helmet, which is explicitly described. Yeah? Yes. And also, as an aside, I was the technical advisor on a Hollywood movie called King David with Richard Gere. It opened for a week in Los Angeles and then went straight to video. But this was not my fault. And on really, excuse me, this is really an aside. They had a lot of dummy corpses to lie around on the field, but they were all of a certain exact same length. So they needed an extra one for Goliath. So they took two of them and cut them in half and stuck them together. But if you look carefully, you will see that Goliath has two bottoms, because that's the... Sorry, yes. There's a chapter on this in the Rabbi Reads the Bible, if you're into movies. Anyway, the other thing which militates against the usual story is that Goliath, having been hit like this, actually falls on his face. Now, the alternative scenario depends on the similarity between the word for forehead, metzach, and for greaves, mitzchot. Now, greaves are the armor that protects the lower legs, and it is hinged at the knee joint. Otherwise, you couldn't walk. Now, this aspect of the armor is explicitly narrated at the beginning of the story, so it's part of what we are expecting to learn about. The more likely reading is that the stone caught Goliath just above the knee and sank down behind the knee armor so that he couldn't straighten his leg, causing him to stumble and fall. And once down, he couldn't get up. Now, this reading is reinforced by the story's emphasis on the enormous weight of Goliath's armor. David's tactic was to use Goliath's own weapon against him by finding his one weak spot in his armor, which is a classical guerrilla tactic which David was famous for. So, to Achilles' heel, we should add Goliath's knee. I hope I have sown sufficient confusion to back up my opening remark. With the Hebrew Bible, we are dealing with a highly sophisticated literature in a uniquely finely tuned language, which demands to be treated with appropriate tools and sensitivity. In fact, of course, the Hebrew Bible is a library of books and texts reflecting many periods and genres, some of which are mutually contradictory, and each of which requires its own particular set of keys to open it. And not all keys are any more available to us. We have to try to find them ourselves. And moreover, precisely because of the nature of the material, especially when it's narrative or poetry, it resists being systematized or dogmatized. It poses questions rather than provides answers. And it demands not unconditional surrender on our part, but engagement and struggle, including calling into question its values, following the models provided by Abraham and Moses, among others. Thus, the process of interpretation begins within the biblical canon itself, long before the task undertaken by later generations. Now, in order to examine how Jewish exegesis has developed, we need to learn a couple of terms and something of the traditional Jewish understanding of the makeup of the Hebrew Bible. The key term, of course, is Torah, which inevitably has a number of senses. It is derived from a Hebrew verb meaning to shoot arrows at a target, so that on one level it indicates a direction and a purpose. It is used in the Hebrew Bible to mean an individual law or a collection of laws and teachings from God. The rabbis spoke of the written Torah, by which they meant initially the first 5 books of Moses, given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, but the term was later extended to include the entire Hebrew Bible. But rabbinic tradition bases itself on the concept of an oral Torah, a set of interpretations of the written Torah given verbally to Moses at the same time that were handed down through the generations. Thus, Torah became extended to include all subsequent rabbinic exegesis and indeed all teachings derived directly or indirectly from the Hebrew Bible. Torah, in one teaching, becomes the blueprint with which God created the world, but also the continuing guidance given to humanity, expressed in terms of law and ethical values. In this broadest sense, the Torah is the way. Now, to return to the structure of the Hebrew Bible itself, the first 5 books of Moses are understood by rabbinic tradition as the core of the divine revelation. They are the unmediated Word of God, dictated to and faithfully recorded by Moses. The next layer around this core is represented by the Prophetic Books, which surprisingly include Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings, as well as those of the great named prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and the minor prophets. By including these earlier, usually understood as historic books under the title prophetic, their significance is not restricted to the past, and they carry an equal immediacy and authenticity. However, as the rabbi said, no 2 prophets prophesied in the same style, and with this phrase they acknowledged the extent to which the Word of God was mediated by the individual prophet's personal understanding, experience, and literary skills. Unlike the direct Word of God through Moses, a greater human element affected the witness of the prophetic books. The third division, the writings, includes Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the 5 Megillot or scrolls, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes and Esther, and the final books, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah and Chronicles. And these were designated as being inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. That is to say, along the God-human spectrum, these were furthest from a direct divine word. Indeed, it has been suggested that whereas the Torah represented the divine self-revelation to humanity, the writings, especially works like Psalms and Job, represent our human self-revelation to God. Now, already we can see something of a nuanced understanding of the different elements of the Hebrew Bible. But if we are to focus on Jewish interpretation of the Bible itself, the other major term that needs to be introduced is midrash. It's derived from a verb darash, to search out or to seek. And midrash refers both to the process of investigating the deeper meaning of biblical texts and to a series of collections of such interpretations, ranging classically from the 2nd to the 9th centuries of the Common Era. Now, these collections are usually divided into 2 categories: halachic or legal midrash, which explores the practical and legal implications of the text with its consequences for our behavior, and Agadic, which is narrative or homiletic midrash, which contains a free-ranging exploration of all sorts of themes: historical, ethical, political, anecdotal, often humorous ones, things that the rabbis discovered in their engagement with the text. Now, midrash works on the assumption that there are shivim panim la Torah, 70 faces to the Torah. That is to say, an infinite number of possible interpretations of each and every verse. A favorite analogy is based on a phrase taken from the book of Jeremiah, 23:29, that God's word is like a hammer breaking a rock. The sparks that fly are the many possible interpretations that arise. And we've reached here the heart of the Jewish engagement with the Hebrew Bible, namely the seriousness and sometimes the playfulness with which each letter, word, phrase and sentence must be treated as representing the utterance of God. But since God is infinite, so the range of possible readings is infinite. Now, there is a rabbinic debate that is instructive about 2 potential directions that exegesis can take. It concerns the question as to who wrote the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy that depicts the death of Moses. Two views arise. In one, God dictated the chapter to Moses, who recorded his own death with tears streaming from his eyes. In this view, revelation, prophecy, and the mystical insight are all lodged in the words and the letters of the Torah. However, the other view, also expressed within the same rabbinic tradition, is that the chapter was written by Joshua, Moses' successor. And here we find the rational, logical, historical approach, which will also continually reappear. So we have created in our tradition two quite distinctive poles of exegetical understanding. Indeed, a major disagreement existed between two great rabbinic figures of the 2nd century, Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Ishmael. The former, Rabbi Akiba, the great mystic, derived laws and teachings from the presence of little words like et, that merely indicate that the word that follows is the object of the verb. From this little word et, he derived all sorts of laws, because if God said it, it cannot be redundant, and so a deeper meaning is to be sought. This is the mystical approach. His opponent, Rabbi Ishmael, came up with the phrase, Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The words of Torah are spoken in human language. That is to say, God too is restricted by the conventions of Hebrew grammar. Needless to say, both views are preserved and employed. So while the imagination and fantasy of rabbinic interpretation could be boundless, there had to be limitations set in matters where practical consequences were to be derived for society. Thus, in all matters pertaining to Jewish law, the decision of the majority carries the day. And this is a principle itself derived homiletically from the Torah. And the Babylonian Talmud is the great compendium containing a record of rabbinic discussions over some 5 centuries, and is itself an artfully constructed and unique literary work. It records the rabbinic debates themselves, as well as both the minority and majority opinions and the decisions when they are reached. One celebrated rabbinic anecdote relates how the authority of the majority decision-making was put to the test. On a certain occasion, Rabbi Eliezer used all possible arguments to substantiate his opinions, but the rabbis did not accept it. He said, "If I am right, may this carob tree move 100 yards from its place." And the carob tree began to move. The rabbi said, "From a tree no proof can be brought." Then he said, "May the canal prove it." And the water of the canal flowed backwards. They said, "Water cannot prove anything." Then he said, "May the walls of this house of study prove it." Then the walls of the house bent inwards, as if they were about to fall. And Rabbi Joshua rebuked the walls and said, "When scholars are discussing the law, walls have nothing to do with it." So to honor Rabbi Joshua, the walls did not fall down. But to honor Rabbi Eliezer, they didn't become quite straight again. And they remain bent till this day, says the Talmud. Then Rabbi Eliezer said, "If I am right, let the heavens prove it." Then a heavenly voice said, "What have you against Rabbi Eliezer? The law is always according to him." And Rabbi Joshua got up and said, quoting the book of Deuteronomy, to God, "Lo bashamayim hi, it is not in heaven." What did he mean by this? Rabbi Jeremiah said, "The Torah was given to us from Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice. For already from Sinai the law said, by a majority you are to decide." Now, it's not every day that you tell God off and ask him to not interfere. So the rabbis were a little bit nervous, and Rabbi Nathan met Elijah the prophet. Now, if you recall, Elijah never died because he went to heaven in a small rocket ship or something. So that when Rabbi Nathan met Elijah, he asked him, "What did God say at that time?" And Elijah replied, He laughed and said, "My children have conquered me. My children have grown up." The story is breathtaking in the liberties it takes with voices from heaven, but also the image of God that it portrays, delighted that the rabbis have taken sufficient responsibility for their world, even to the extent of silencing God for intervening. The children have grown up. The world of the Midrash extended into the Middle Ages, when different kinds of exegesis appeared, deeply influenced by the Christian or Muslim culture in which Jews lived. From Christianity, Jews borrowed the 4 levels of exegesis, but expressed them in Jewish terms as pshat, the plain meaning of the text. And here let me explain. Sometimes the word pshat is translated as the literal meaning, but that is not what is intended. And I learnt this from a very great Bible teacher, Nechama Leibovitz, in Jerusalem, who said, if you're walking in the street and you see somebody changing the wheel of his car, and you walk up to him and say, "Have you had a puncture?" And he says, "Yes, you idiot, can't you see I've had a puncture?" Has he understood your question? No. He's understood your literal question, have you had a puncture? But what was your real question? Yeah, can I help you? Do you need some assistance? Yes. Which is the real meaning? Now, the pshat is the attempt to discover the meaning behind the question, and not just the literal meaning. And so there's even a rabbinic saying that somebody who translates the Bible literally is a liar. Interesting. So the first level is the pshat, the plain meaning. Then there is darash, the deeper meaning which we've already discussed. Remez, literally hint, implies the allegorical interpretations, and the word sod, meaning secret, or means the mystical readings. And these 4 levels, pshat, remez, drash, and sod, spell pardes, which is a paradise, which is an orchard, which is a nice mnemonic for it. Now, at the same time as in Christian Europe, these levels were being explored by great Bible scholars like Rashi, at the same time in Spain, under the influence of the extraordinary intellectual developments within Islamic thought, a whole range of new disciplines were brought to bear on the study of the Hebrew Bible, ranging from grammar and philology to comparative linguistics and philosophy, as well as other sciences. And with the advent of printing, editions of the Hebrew Bible were produced containing a number of different commentaries ranged around the biblical text, representing a whole series of voices from different continents and contexts and centuries in a constant discussion with one another and with the biblical text, ranging across the centuries. It's only in modernity, in the wake of the Enlightenment, and more particularly the Emancipation, that a major break came about with this tradition. The historical critical approach associated with Wellhausen and his successors was seen in the Jewish world as an assault on the very foundation of Jewish tradition and the authority of the Torah. As somebody once put it bluntly, in the title of a lecture he asked me to give, quotes, "If Moses did not write the Torah, why bother?" End quote. In one sense, the new scholarship of that period, which, by the way, owes its origins in part to another Jewish scholar, Spinoza, this approach has been somehow accommodated within the more rational strand within Judaism associated with reform, liberal, progressive and conservative movements. Whereas the more faith-based assumptions remain the core of the different strands of Jewish orthodoxy. More recent biblical scholarship, which has opened the way to a more literary approach to the text, has rediscovered something of the close reading associated with rabbinic forms of exegesis, and it can be no accident that many of the leading practitioners of this field are Jewish scholars. I'd like to end with 2 anecdotes that have been important in my own approach to biblical studies. Some years ago, I had the privilege of teaching for a few weeks while she was performing in London the great singer and cabaret artist Pearl Bailey. Following a near fatal heart attack, she'd been studying theology at Georgetown University. and she used the opportunity of her London visit to come to Leobeck College, where I teach. We discussed, from Isaiah chapter 5, the Song of the Vineyard, and I explained the way in which he introduces the audience and tries to get them engaged and then tells them that they're the ones who are responsible for something. And Pearl said that this was exactly the same way she worked her cabaret act. You get people engaged with a fast song, then you talk a little bit, then a slow song, then another fast one. So we had a good discussion about how to read the Bible as a cabaret exercise. But she mentioned one thing in passing, namely that when you are performing with an orchestra, she said, it is as important to pay attention to the orchestra as to pay attention to the audience in front of you. Because if you don't take the orchestra seriously, they lose interest and start messing around in the back. Now, if anyone needs that advice, please take it seriously. But it seemed to me that the role of the interpreter of a text was not dissimilar. We had to try to enter the world of the text as far as this is possible and understand it in its own terms. And this is the orchestra, so to speak, behind us. But then we have to try to convey what we have learnt to the audience in front of us in their own, often very different world of understanding. The second story goes back to 1968, when I was involved with a Jewish youth conference in Scotland. Amongst the participants was a group of young people from Czechoslovakia. They stayed on after the conference to visit the Edinburgh Festival, but while they were still in Scotland, the Russians marched into Prague, and many of them were forced to remain in Britain in exile. During the conference, we had studied the Hebrew Bible, and they were very quick to grasp what was going on, even though they had never studied it or read it before. So I asked them why, and they said it was quite simple. When you read a newspaper in Prague, they said, you ask yourself, if that is what they have written, what really happened? And then you ask, if that is what really happened, what are they trying to make us think by what they've written? And then you ask yourself, if that is what they're trying to make us think, what should we think instead? You learn to read between the lines and beyond the lines, as if your life depended on understanding what was there. And it seemed to me at the time, and it still does so today, that this is how to read the Hebrew Bible, between the lines and beyond the lines, and as if our life depended on understanding what was there. Or as the rabbis expressed it, turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Those of you who are leaving, I would ask that you do so quietly out of respect for those that are staying behind. Could you please speak to the origins of the youth conference you created, and is there significance to its location in Germany?
Oh, yes. I happened to be in Israel in 1967, and before the Six-Day War, and with my shaky medical qualifications, volunteered and worked in Hadassah Hospital. And they looked at my qualifications and they put me in the delivery room. And I spent the Six-Day War doing episiotomy repairs. People will explain to each other what that's about. But while I was there, I got a telegram from Berlin, where a rabbi and a pastor and a Catholic nun had come together and had with the following idea, that beyond the political reality of Israel and the Arab world stood the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And surely there must be some way in which the religions could come together and find ways of collaborating and coordinating with each other and finding new kinds of dimensions beyond the political conflict. So on the spot, they created a conference, and when I joined, and they sent me a telegram saying, working and praying for all of you, which was very nice. I'd rather it said working and praying for you, Jonathan, but if they want to be, it was a committee decision, obviously, and fine. But as a result of it, we started a small conference. And because the paradox and the irony of all of this is that it was only in Germany, precisely because of its history, because of the sense of guilt about the past and its relationship with Judaism, that there was a kind of openness to the idea of creating a framework where Jews, Christians and Muslims could meet. And what we did was to set up a conference with the idea that the future religious leaders of the three communities should meet while they were still students. So all the rabbinic students at Leo Baeck College come to this conference. It's a week long, once a year as part of their training. And Christian theology students and Muslim community workers and social workers and teachers join us. And it's been going now for some 36 years. And it's been it is in Germany precisely because of that particular past. It is also important for my rabbinic students to go there because they have to face their own ghosts and prejudices too about Germany now that we are 60 years on. A very difficult and delicate issue, but nevertheless an important one. If we are to live in Europe and we are to see a flourishing Jewish community in Europe, it has to be conscious of where it is now and not just live off the past. It has to build a future which is somewhat different. So the conference takes place there. How successful it is, who knows? I do know that after 36 years, if I ever come to any interfaith conference anywhere in the world, I will find somebody who told me he came to that conference 20 years ago and it had a great influence on his success, his later life. So that's why it's there and that's what it does.
Would you please comment on the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament?
Well, one's in English and one's in Hebrew. And of course there are in Germany, for example, they don't like using the Old Testament, they refer to the First Testament, or attempt to indicate that it is not old in the sense that it's passé and that the new is better, but there are two different documents. The major difference, in fact, lies in the order of the books. If you look at I gave you an outline of the Hebrew Bible. In the Christian Old Testament, you get Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and then Chronicles. That's to say, those books are organized along historic grounds, which means that you read them as history. Now there is, in the Jewish version, for example, the book of Judges is regarded as a prophetic book. And there is one chilling chapter which I would recommend that you look at in Judges chapter 9. It tells the story of a man called Avimelech, the son of Gideon, who decides he wants to be king. He goes to the people of Shechem. He's an outsider to his family. He goes to the people of Shechem and says, look, you're my family. Is it better that 70 people, the sons of Gideon, rule us, or one person? They give him some money, with that which they take from the temple of Baal Berit, and with that money they buy up a bunch of gangsters who become his sort of followers. He then takes his 70 brothers and assassinates them on one stone, it says, which suggests that he had a kind of show trial and killed them all off. And then the citizens of Shechem elect him as king. Those 9 verses are a paradigm of the rise... Oh, I've just lost my...
Hold on.
Come in, number 4, your time is up. Oh, yes, hand back. Right. Those 9 verses are a paradigm of the rise of Hitler, if you like, or of any fascist dictator. They are a warning, but they have to be seen not as a historical past, but as a potential prophetic reality. The prophets in the whole talk about contemporary reality, not about the future. They see the contemporary reality, as it were, through the eyes of God. And they become, therefore, a very valuable warning. So I'm just saying this, that those historical books, which are in the Old Testament historical, being prophetic in the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, do give a different kind of edge to them. So that's one distinction. And the last point is this, that I think Daniel is included in the Christian Bible among the prophets, but is relegated in the Jewish Bible to the back of the book, to the writings. And there is a rabbinic comment to the effect that Daniel didn't quite understand what he was saying, and therefore he didn't deserve to be included among the prophets. Now, he's also, of course, partly in Aramaic, and it's apocalyptic, and so forth. So there was a reason why the rabbis weren't so happy with Daniel, and of course this is problematic, I suspect, for Christians, for whom the book is more significant in certain ways, but we rather keep him at the back somewhere.
In view of the findings of modern science, how do you think about the origin story?
What a simple question. And since I know nothing about what's happening in America, I can answer it with total innocence. And strangely enough, I was having a conversation about it earlier today with someone who is in the field of science. If you look at Genesis 1, it is probably an attempt at what, given the fact that it's a world in which God is engaged in the world, or gods are engaged in the world, Genesis 1 is an extraordinarily scientific text. It is a text which sees through the contemporary mythologies. There are no warring gods. There are no sea monsters. It is a text which locates the sun and the moon not as semi-deities, but as clocks put up in the sky to help us tell the time. It is a total demythologizing of a contemporary worldview. So it is an extraordinary, revolutionary reading of the world, given that God has to be located somewhere in that world, in the center of things. So it's a very pure and brilliant evocation of how it was assumed the world came into being. As to issues around whether you can use it as a contemporary text for the historical truth about how the world came into being, I rely upon the same question being asked in the Middle Ages when Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, said, if contemporary science indicates that the story of creation is not as recorded or depicted in the first chapter of Genesis, then we simply have to reinterpret the first chapter of Genesis along the lines of scientific understanding. Does that help?
The detailed examination of the Hebrew Bible seems justified by the idea that every detail of the books is written by God, when much evidence exists that these Bible books were written by man, hence susceptible to human error and misunderstanding. Is it appropriate to place so much analysis on merely human products?
I like that. A friend of mine, a man called Gabriel Josipovici, who wrote a book called The Book of God, which is a brilliant literary study of it. Gabriel Josipovici, The Book of God. I really would recommend that. Gabriel came to the Bible rather late. His main field has been European literature. He's a great master of Marcel Proust and of Kafka. And when he wrote this book, I met him some years ago, and he invited him to read the book of the stories of Joseph, because he was as a literary scholar, and it got him hooked on the Bible, and he ended up writing a book about it. But he raises the question: why does somebody invest a certain amount of energy in the Bible and somebody else in Shakespeare? There are people for whom Shakespeare becomes, as it were, a kind of central guiding source of wisdom and understanding, though we know Shakespeare was not God, but was a human being, or whoever he really was, who wrote a series of plays. I suppose there's one level of answer which just says anything which has that level of survival, of challenge, which forces so many generations to re-examine it and to seek truth within it, earns the title revelation, even if it is mediated through human beings. But that's a very delicate and difficult sort of tension to maintain. My own feeling is that when I first discovered the Hebrew Bible, and I have the advantage of not having a very good Jewish education to start with, I came to it fresh. I came to Hebrew fresh, and therefore was forced to get beneath the surface of the language and to try to understand it in this biblical context. And somehow there comes a point when you are engaged at that level, when even if you are irritated with it, even if you violently disagree with it, even if you are not sure where it really comes from, it gets so under your skin that you cannot ignore it. And even if you have to sort of argue against it quite vehemently and be upset about parts of it, as the rabbis were, if it says go out and slaughter the Canaanites, what do you do with that? The rabbis said, well, the Canaanites nowadays aren't the same as they used to be, so you don't have to bother. The Assyrians, very serious. They said, look, the Assyrians came, deported the entire population and replaced them, so the issues don't apply anymore. That is to say, even when you disagree with it and violently and want to argue against it, it somehow is a very powerful and on some level revealed text. The mechanism whereby it came to us, I don't necessarily follow the rabbinic tidy division into Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim in writings in this sense. I also acknowledge that the Torah itself, the 5 books, are human artifacts, but I would take them as being deeply and divinely inspired because they're the truth within them and the possibility of discovering always something new in them and something which becomes strangely relevant still is as far as I can get in seeing it as revealed text. But it's a difficult question, and it's one which I suspect everybody has to make up their own individual minds for. I think the only problem is once it becomes dogmatic, and the possibility of arguing or deciding for oneself as to how far one accepts it, when that becomes a dogma, then it becomes problematic. I think in Judaism we are more interested in, just an aside, there is a rabbinic statement where God apparently says, I don't mind if they don't believe in me, as long as they do what I say. Perhaps that's the good way to stop.
2 questions about Abraham and the potential sacrifice of his son. Was Abraham hearing voices other than God's to please sacrifice his son? And then another questioner asked about the theory that the sacrifice of Isaac was in fact to teach the people of that time that child sacrifice to God was not necessary and wrong.
The latter question is probably true. It is, I'm sure that the story has that level of understanding, but it is to deny the legitimacy of child sacrifice in that world. And it has to be an extreme story to do that. As to whether Abraham is listening, which voice Abraham is listening to, the text itself raises this question. And here, let me just point to something again in the Hebrew which is often overlooked. The various names used for God in the Bible, which became the basis of the Wellhausen school of Elohist and Yahwist, there are a couple of names of God, one of which, Elohim, seems to be a more general term for God. And then there is the famous Tetragrammaton, the letters Yud, He, Vav, He, which Jews traditionally do not pronounce, which is a more intimate name of God that belongs to Israel's relationship with God. Now, the interchange of these 2 names sometimes serves a narrative purpose. And it is fascinating that at the beginning of Genesis 22, the story of the binding of Isaac, it is under the name Elohim that God tests Abraham, and the first part of the chapter is described. At the end of the chapter, it is the other name. It is the Malach Adonai. It is the angel of Adonai, Yud He Vav He, who intervenes and saves the son. So, there are occasions when the distinction between the two names represent a kind of internal conflict within one of the characters. If you recall the story of Bilam, who was invited to curse Israel, he speaks to God, who says, "You can't go." Then he gets another invitation, and God seems to say, "Yes, you can go." And then God tries to stop him with an angel with a sword. The names of God switch between those two yes and no things, which suggests that you have a kind of internal conflict within Bilam, where he wants to do it, but he can't do it, but he doesn't, and so on. So the question is, what I'm basically doing to you, I'm afraid, is making your question more complicated than you thought it was, so forgive me. But given that the story begins with the name Elohim, as opposed to the Yud He Vav He, it may well be that under the surface is the implication that the voice that Abraham is listening to is not necessarily God's voice. It is the conventional religious voice of his time, perhaps, which he is hearing. But that's perhaps too simple a way out. It seems to me that the whole complexity of that relationship between God and Abraham, which has been acted out over 10 previous chapters, has reached a kind of climax. And it's as if when God promised Abraham that he would have a son, he tried to guarantee it by taking Hagar and having Ishmael. Ishmael has gone. Now Isaac is there. Happy end. What happens if God says, "I'm taking that child as well. Do you still trust me enough to wait for my final completion of my promise?" Maybe that's the test that Abraham has to face. The only thing I would repeat what I said earlier. It does seem to me that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, which the rabbis, by the way, noticed. I heard yesterday in the talk the idea that there's two calls from the angel to Abraham. The first one says, "Do not strike the lad," I think it says. And apparently Abraham was so keen on killing him, he said, "Look, could I just scrape him a bit and get a little bit of blood to prove I was keen?" So the angel then says, "And do not do anything to him." So there is a kind of tension in the story as to whether Abraham was right in wanting to sacrifice him, or should have just said, "To hell with you, this is my son, I'm damned if I'm going to kill him." Did Abraham succeed or fail? Maybe God was waiting to the very last minute in the hope that he would say no, and had to send an angel to stop him at the last minute. You can read that story so many ways. But yes, it is against child sacrifice, obviously. It is deeply centered on this human predicament about violence and about the justification of violence, and whether God wishes it or does not wish it. And that's an unresolvable tension, but one which we have to engage with. And therefore the story, which is read every Rosh Hashanah, and in other places as well, forces us to ask these questions and come to whatever conclusion we can in our own particular situation.
Speaking of that tension, I have a question that asks, why doesn't the Lord intervene to stop the horrors that go on around the world? And the questioner asks things such as Darfur.
Oh, that is the question. The late Rabbi Hugo Grin, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, used to say, when people ask the question, "Where was God?" I answer, "Where was man?" And whereas you can argue about God's presence when there is a natural catastrophe, when there is a human disaster, when people murder other people in the name of some ideology or nationalism, it is irrelevant to ask where God is. It is relevant only to ask, where are human beings? Why do we not intervene? Why do we allow these things to happen? To blame God is, I think, to pass the buck in a way which is disgraceful. Because unless we have done all that we can, it's like the thing about the third and fourth generation. It is the responsibility that we carry is enormous as human beings. And it is something which affects not only us individually, but of course all of those who are part of our wider world and our dependencies and so forth. That is the question I think it has to be asked. And I stay with Hugo on that one. Where was man? And where is man? And why isn't man doing more?
Would you comment on the book of Job?
Come back next week. No. An extraordinary book, and what can one say? It represents, of course, the greatest of that same line of tradition of Abraham arguing, of Moses arguing with God, of challenging God. But also Job basically is challenging his contemporary theologians, who have a very pat, structured, clear view of the universe. Good deeds get good results, bad deeds get bad results, end of the problem. And Job, who is deliberately described as innocent, though I think a little arrogant is partly what is the problem with Job, but nevertheless innocent, is subjected to enormous sort of suffering. So it's part of that argument, protest. Look, basically the Hebrew Bible is about engagement with God, struggling with human situations. There are no pat answers, but the struggle itself, the name Yisrael, one who struggles with God, the struggle itself is what life is all about. And there are no comfortable and easy answers, but the engagement is what counts. And Job is a classical example, and other books as well, like Ecclesiastes, in a very different way, ask the same sorts of questions. As I said, the Bible provides more questions than answers, but that's why it's such fun.
How can a common someone learn more about Hebrew translation?
Any common someone who can ask such a question is not really common and not just a someone. Look, in America you have such enormous resources of both university, and you've got temples and synagogues all over the place. Knock on the door, join a Hebrew class. There's any number of opportunities. I think the point only to make is this, that it's actually worth it. It looks a bit sort of scary at first, because they write, as My Fair Lady says, the Hebrews write it backwards, which is positively frightening. But it can be done. Let me give you an example. I organize for nearly 40 years now an annual Jewish Christian Bible study week in Germany, to which you're all invited if you wish to come. And in one of the early years we had 3 nuns, one of whom was in her 70s, had never studied Hebrew, but got hooked as a result of being at the first week, came back the following year having learnt the alphabet in the first week, came back the following year with a Gesenius dictionary of Hebrew grammar and a Hebrew Bible. And, well, nuns perhaps have more time, but she managed in that year to really get into the text, though she was in her 70s. And so, yes, it can be done, and I think it's worth it. But you need to have a kind of a circle in which you can actually try it out. And access to the rabbinic commentaries, there's a lot of the stuff available in English, though you often need a bit of guidance as to how to deal with it. Just a clue, if you ever read the great medieval commentator Rashi, who is the most popular of the Jewish commentators, you have to ask yourself the following question. What is the problem in the text that Rashi saw which led him to give the answer that he gave? Because he doesn't usually explain. So if you read Rashi, you just get a very strange text. But if you ask what was the problem in the Hebrew text to which this is the answer, then it all becomes very clear and very enlightening. So you need a few tricks of the trade, but a good teacher will introduce you to those. No problem.
Finally, perhaps off topic of interpretation of text, the questioner asked if you might comment a little bit about what's going on in terms of anti-Semitism in Great Britain, and especially in the universities and the press.
There is clearly a rise in anti-Semitic incidents in England. They're often related to events in the Middle East. So with the incursion into Lebanon and the war there last summer, of course, a few incidents increased. My concern about anti-Semitism is I have to be clear about this. When there's going to be a bunch of Meshuggahs out there, whatever, and if they aren't picking on Jews, they're picking on Muslims, or they're picking on blacks, or they're picking on somebody. As long as what is being done is not state-sponsored, state-supported, or state-ignored, then it's a kind of irritation and a pain that you can put up with. It is only when it becomes something which is tacitly accepted by the society as a whole, or by the state in particular, that you need to get worried. And as far as I can see, certainly in England this is not the case. Any such incidents are carefully investigated and are dealt with. That's one level, I think, which has to be taken very seriously. There is a kind of probably American Jewish sort of fantasy that don't take a plane to Europe because they're out to get you. Don't go to France because it's totally anti-Semitic, it's full of nasty Arabs killing Jews. Don't go to England because and so forth. I think you have to sort of step back a little bit from that level of fantasy, frankly. But in France it's more difficult because you do have a large Muslim population, and you do have conflict there. But again, it is something which is addressed by the state and is investigated when things occur. But it's much more uncomfortable, no question, in France. But in England, it is certainly not an issue. Regarding the boycott, the academic boycott against Israeli academics, this is pretty disgraceful. That intelligent academics can actually produce such a thing. It was erased about 2 or 3 years ago and was shouted out of court. What has happened is that 2 academic unions have now come together, which were not previously joined, and as a result, the same issue was raised again and went through an early stage of acceptance at some level. It is still not a complete victory in terms of that desire, and there is a great sort of letter writing and marshalling of resources to counteract it in the UK. It is serious, obviously, and it is kind of ugly and stupid, and you will begin to see. I saw a letter written to the British Medical Association just indicating how ludicrous it was by somebody who'd been in Israel and seen Palestinians who'd been wounded by Hamas being treated in Israeli hospitals. You know, there's a kind of reality check that needs to be made. Nevertheless, it is a reality that is being exploited by some people. So I suppose there is a kind of low-level anti-Semitism in England, but it has never really manifested itself in ways which were sufficiently serious to warrant great anxiety beyond the individual Meshuggahs. But every synagogue has people outside watching, looking at it, guarding it during services. But in Germany also, the police guard synagogues in Germany, which is very strange, and in other places as well. It's a kind of precaution rather than a real threat. I must confess that when I was in Cincinnati a few weeks ago for the ordination service of Hebrew Union College, I noticed that outside of the temple where it took place, there were police cars which were shuffling the traffic around. And I couldn't resist suggesting, perhaps in America you are so scared about anti-Semitic attacks that you put police guards outside synagogues. They got awfully angry with me. How dare you suggest such a thing? Well, tough. There is a reality about minority groups being under threat in a society which is so complex and so difficult as ours sometimes is. But nevertheless, I think you have overestimated the anxieties in England, certainly. If I have to live in a country outside of America, which I would love to live in, obviously, England's about the best place to be.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Jonathan Magonet.
For more information on the Chautauqua Institution, including a catalog of our full audio program, please visit our website at www.ciweb.org or call 800-836-2787 or write to Chautauqua Institution, Box 28, Chautauqua, New York 14722.